So Bob Newhart is going to talk about
Bob Newhart.
Newhart, yeah, that was a Freudian slip. He is pretty funny though.
Can I have his retirement income?
And maybe he looks the same. I was practicing, I said, I'm not going to say that, and I didn't say it anyway. But welcome to Around the World, and please silence your cell phones. Thank you.
Now, before we start, I'm silencing my phone. Before we start, there's big news, and the news is at 6:32 this morning, number one grandson. There's Dad, a little tired. He changed his first diaper, he tells me. So there's more of those to come. So that's now that's done. I'm done. I'll see you guys real soon. Okay. Today's talk is about our trip to the UK, and it combined a week of driving around in the south of England and a 12-day Princess cruise that went around up from Southampton all the way around Ireland and Scotland, and one brief stop in Le Havre so we could see Paris. One does not see Paris in one day, especially if you've got a 2.5-hour drive to Paris and back on the same day. So it's going to be a brief stop, and really the only reason I'm showing it is the scaffolding around the Notre Dame Cathedral is there, and we all know what that cost. And that was 9 months after we saw there. So that's the trip. Let's get going. As many of you know, I'm a map freak, and I use maps to track wherever I'm traveling, and so this is the trip. We flew to, it doesn't show it, Gatwick on Norwegian Airlines. Gatwick because it's closer to the south of England. It's not that much closer than Heathrow, but with traffic, it's a lot closer than Heathrow. And from there, we rented a car and drove to 4 places. It was Winchester, Weymouth. Does anyone want to venture that name, pronounce that name? Foy. It's not Foy or Foy or anything, it's Foy. So that's something that one learns rather quickly, because they're not amused when they say it's Foy that rhymes with joy. And then we went to Exeter and then Southampton, where we met some friends that I had met on a cruise in Tahiti back in 2005. They live in just a little bit south of Manchester, well, a lot south of Manchester. And they drove down, and then they took us to Stonehenge, Bath, and Portsmouth. From then we went on the cruise, and then all the way around. We stopped in St. Peter Port, which is Guernsey, and then to Cork, to Dublin, to Belfast, to Glasgow, to Inverness, to Edinburgh, down to Le Havre, bus ride to Paris, and then back. So 7 days here and 12 days around there.
19.
What?
So total 19 days then?
Total was, yeah, give or take. I think you lose a day in travel as well. Who knows? It's all fuzzy to me. We went on the 23rd, and actually we landed on the 23rd. I think we took off on the 22nd.
Yeah.
So that was our trip. We rented a car in Gatwick, and I had this all planned. My iPad has T-Mobile, therefore you can get GPS, and this was going to take us on our trip. Who's driven in England? Some of you. It's interesting. So, what?
When you step off a curb, it's even worse.
In Dublin, they have signs. When you get to the curb, it says, look right. That's because they're coming this way. So they know that American tourists get all the time. So rented this car, went out, got in the car, started it up, turned on the iPad, and it says, no service. So getting around England isn't easy. I went running back in and I said, okay, I'm not getting service right now. How do I get out of the airport and on the road to Winchester? And the gal behind the counter went. Didn't occur to me at the time, but they get a cut when they rent the GPS. So she played dumb, and I said, okay, £10 a day to rent that dumb thing. We get there, put it in the car, it gives us directions, we're starting to drive out of the airport, and the iPad says, hi! And starts to give us directions as well. So the first day was easy driving. We'd been on the plane for 11 hours already. So all we had to do was get from Gatwick to Winchester. Do you see a straight line? No. The iPad and the GPS told us different ways. That was a repeated theme for the whole 4 days that we drove in this car. And it gave us some good jokes, it gave us some real puzzlement, but that was our first day. So we actually went this way and down to Winchester. Wouldn't have guessed that, but that's what they told us to do.
Bob, that's why they have tours.
Okay, the roads in England, they have M's, which are freeways, and they're only exciting because you're on the wrong side. Other than that, we all know how Southern Californians, we can handle freeways. They have A roads and B roads. An A road can be anything but a freeway, just a little bit smaller, to, oh my goodness. And then they have B roads. A B road is a slight improvement over a horse trail, but not much. And you'll see B roads, pictures of B roads later on. Going to everywhere, we didn't meet any until we got to Foy. So this was our first trip. We spent, the friends of ours told us they were going to stay at premier inns, and they said they're inexpensive and okay, so that's what we did through most of the trip. And so we would drive to where we wanted in the afternoon. In the morning, we would then tour, and then come midday, mid-afternoon, we would drive on to the next place. And that turned out to be a pretty good way to do it. So our first stop was Winchester and the cathedral. And it is a gorgeous cathedral. I'd actually been there once before, 23 years before, and liked it so much we decided to go back. And besides, it was just a couple hours drive out of Gatwick. We picked a lot of them based on how far and how long. So this is Winchester Cathedral. And I defy you to think of that without thinking of the song out of the 60s. Winchester Cathedral. They have repair work going. Who's been to a cathedral that didn't have scaffolding or didn't have repair work? You'd figure if they built something in the 1100s, it would last. They wouldn't have to repair it all the time, but they don't. So, this is Winchester, and here is their main stained glass window. Okay, what's unusual about this stained glass window?
It's big.
There are a lot of them are big. Second choice.
Not very big.
It doesn't really show pictures. It's more like a mosaic of all kinds of different colored glass, and there's a reason for that. In the 1600s, 1660s, in England, what happened? The Civil War. And who's the bad guy on the Civil War? Cromwell. Winchester Cathedral was the richest cathedral in all of England. Beat anything in London, beat Canterbury, and it was a real target. So Cromwell and his gang came down, rode their horses into the cathedral, and used muskets and shot out all the windows. And then they used the cathedral as a stable for their horses while they were there, and then they moved on to do more damage throughout all of England and Ireland and wherever else Cromwell went. 20 years later, after it's all settled, and people that had scooped up all the glass and hidden it, brought it all out, and they tried to figure out how were we going to reproduce it. They decided there's no way to reproduce it, so they made a mosaic of all kinds of glass. And they used their own 17th century glass, but the glass in the original was from the 1400s, 1480. So they made a big mosaic. So this is the west window of Winchester Cathedral. And it actually has a few things that you can recognize, people and whatever, but for the most part, it's all a hodgepodge. And actually quite beautiful. Everyone's trip to the UK or to Ireland usually has a theme of we're doing castles, we're doing cathedrals, but one of the two is the main thing. So 20 some years before, when I took the kids and the family, we did lots of castles. This one, lots of cathedrals. My 12-year-old son, the one that just had the little baby, he said, "Not another castle." And the only one he liked is the one we climbed up to the keep and with no windows stared down, I don't know how many stories tall it was. He thought that was cool. As a 12-year-old you would. But other than that, he hated castles. So one of my favorite parts about the cathedrals, really anywhere, are the ceilings. They are gorgeous. And as you can tell, this is looking east from the center of it. This is looking west. And those ceilings are absolutely amazing. By the way,
In the middle?
what?
Are those pieces of iron?
I don't think so. I think they're, I don't know, stone. Some material. I couldn't reach them at the time. And then, of course, a beautiful, beautiful wall. Okay, who knows who's buried in Winchester Cathedral? Think an author?
Jane Austen.
What?
Jane Austen.
Jane Austen. Jane Austen is buried inside the cathedral, and this is her, the stone over her grave. And I won't read it all, but not once does it mention she ever took a pen to paper. Because when she died in 1817, it was not a ladylike thing to be an author. However, about 50 years later, her family put up a plaque on the wall right next to the grave, and it starts right off by saying, "Known to many by her writings." But on the grave itself, not a single mention of her writings. By the way, for many years she lived in Bath, and so we'll be seeing Bath a little bit later. Okay, here's a pub. Gee, what a surprise. There's a pub in England. Look at the name. You might say, who is William Walker? Well, in Winchester, he's a very important guy because he's the diver that reconstructed the basement walls underwater to save the cathedral. He was 1906 to 1911, he was diving underneath and putting bags of cement underneath the walls that were starting to sag. So they really like William Walker in Winchester. He spent 6 years shoving cement bags underneath the walls underwater in Winchester. The water table, by the way, if this is the ground, the water table is about there. And so anything down below was flooded. Okay, so our driving trip, Winchester, Weymouth, Foy, Exeter, and then back over to Southampton. The first stop after Winchester, so we were there in the morning, drove down in the afternoon, arrived in Weymouth. And Weymouth is a town on the south coast, on the English Channel, in Dorsetshire. And it was quite popular starting, well, George III. George III is our famous king that we rebelled against, you know, crazy King George. The three monarchs before, Queen Anne, George I, George II, whenever they needed to get away from London, they went to Bath. And in Bath they had hot springs and indulged in a very nice life. George III was a bit more austere, and he wanted a nice brisk sea and the air. And been in the English Channel? Anyone put your hand in the English Channel? It's cold, isn't it? And the weather, for the most part, is a bit iffy. Now, when we were in the south of England, it was in the middle of a drought. And we got no rain in the south of England, which is unheard of. Now, what is unusual about this beach to us? Pebble Beach. It's all stones. And that is quite common on the English Channel. And they go ahead and lie down on it, walk on it. They're barefoot walking on that. I tried that. I didn't feel too good. But they didn't mind at all. So as soon as King George III started going to Bath, going to Weymouth, all the people of all the peerage and all the people of importance came with him, and Weymouth became a very popular place, and Bath dropped off quite a bit. And so all on the coast there are Georgian homes, Georgian buildings, hotels, and it's really quite nice. We were in one of the little pubs, and sitting next to us on the table, we were outside. There's two young ladies from Northumberland. All right, familiar with where that is? It's up almost in Scotland on the North Sea. And they said, "Where are you from?" We said, "We're from California." And they said, "You're vacationing in England?" We said, "Yes." They said, "Why? They said the weather is horrid." Well, it certainly is in Northumberland. Just watch the PBS Vera, and she's walking around in an overcoat the whole time, winter and summer. So Weymouth is very nice looking. They have lots of flowers. They do have a sandy beach. The area right by the river, and you never guess the name of the river. the River Wey. Weymouth, the mouth of the river. And so right around the mouth of the river, they have a sandy beach. And they're quite proud of that. Now, the third most popular thing in all of UK is war memorials. They have more of those, I think, probably than they do cathedrals and castles. This particular one is for Anzacs, the Australian, New Zealand, and from Gallipoli. They trained in Dorset, and they recuperated in Dorset. They had a terrible time. The Anzac were just ripped apart in Gallipoli. And this being 2018, it was the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, and so the little poppy flowers all over the place. Their famous clock is the Queen Victoria clock that celebrates her 50th anniversary, 1887. She was, I was going to say inaugurated. She was coronated in 1837. So this is 50 years later. Okay, so let's step on a little bit more about Weymouth. For those that are pilots or used to the sea, they've got uniform, golf, Yankee. I thought that was kind of cute. Now, Punch and Judy. I have an English mother, and Punch and Judy shows were part of my youth, and there's now only 3 authorized Punch and Judy shows on the seacoast of all of England, and this is one. There's a difference today. What's wrong with it today? It's closed. It was closed of all of 2018 because the schools in the UK stopped letting parents take their kids out of school to go on vacation, and as a result, the season in Weymouth for the Punch and Judy show went from 17 weeks to 7. And the guy who runs this said, I can't make a living on 7, so he closed it. So now, being one of only 3, and a lot of businesses like to bring the crowds around there so they would go to their restaurants and all that, they're subsidizing them, so it's opened again for 2019. But it was closed for us. All right, Weymouth is famous for its harbor. Used heavily in World War II for D-Day and for training and also taking goods over to France. So the river mouth is very nice, very calm, turns around a bend, so there's no waves inside it. And it was great. All right, now fishing is off, shipping is off, so they have tourists. So B&Bs and restaurants and bars and pubs are now how they make their living in Weymouth. And really anywhere on the coast. Quite a rowdy crowd too when we went by. Okay, here's an old Georgian hotel. And still around, kind of expensive. We stayed in the much cheaper Premier Inns. It's kind of like the bottom level of Best Westerns. It's not the fancy Best Westerns, but the basic Best Westerns. Now, beach houses all over the place in the UK. And those beach houses, individual ones, cost more than a regular home in Manchester. Which is amazing considering no electricity, not allowed to sleep in it, but you can use it as a changing room and whatever. And so the folks from London have skyrocketed the price of these. So if you want to trade your home for one of these beach houses, you probably can. So after going around, we headed off to Fowey. Again, we're in Weymouth, we drove down here to Foy. Starts off pretty good roads, and then they start to get into the smaller of the A's. And there's roundabouts every half a mile, I swear. Can't be true, but I swear. And of course, you're going around the wrong way. And your GPS will say, take the third exit on the roundabout. What they don't tell you always is the first exit isn't counted because it's just a service road. And so now you count 1, 2, 3, turn, and now your GPS is going, make a U-turn, come back, and get back on and take the first one. So after you do this a few times on our way to Foy, then the GPS starts saying, okay, if that's the way he wants to go, then it starts rerouting. And for everywhere you want to go in England, there's 14 ways to get there. So now our iPad and the Garmin are in a locked battle. They don't like what we're doing, and they're constantly telling us to go a different way. So I trusted the Garmin. Joanne is saying, I don't know about this. She's looking at this, and she says, well, it's having us go south, and your Garmin is trying to tell you to go north. So I'm going, no, the other way. I'm sorry, the other way. The iPad's trying to get us north, we're going south, and I'm telling myself, it's southwest from here, the Garmin's got to be correct. Well, Foy this is the river Foy. And the Garmin is telling me to come this way, and the iPad is saying, no, 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 go up this way. And the further we go, the more the iPad is saying, go north. Don't go northwest, go north. And I'm doing this. And then Joanne says, you know, we're coming to a river. I don't see a bridge. And I'm still following the Garmin. And then it said, get in line for the ferry. So, okay, and sure enough, there's cars on the side of the road. Pull in behind them. Now the cars are stacking behind us. We're inching forward. Now, when we landed at Gatwick, it was Saturday afternoon, and we were in a hurry to get over to Winchester. And when we got to Winchester, didn't need cash. Everything was okay. Got to Weymouth, didn't need cash. Everything was okay. So as we're going through this line, a little sign says, cash only. And I've got $300, $400, 20s in my wallet. Not £1, all US dollars. And so by the time we see the sign, we're about the third car on, and all the cars just shove us right onto the ferry. So now we're on the ferry going, what are we going to do? And some kid, looked like 16, comes up to collect our money, which was £2, 2.5 pounds, something like that. And I said, well, we got a problem. And I described, and I took my wallet, opened it up, and you see the stack of 20s in there about this big. I said, all American money. He never said a word. He turned around and he walked away. Then a gentleman comes up who's got to be around 40, and I go through the same thing with him, and he goes, we have a problem. And I'm thinking, yeah, we do. He says, well, he said, the ferry ride is on us, but do me a favor. I said, sure. He said, get some real money. So that's what we did in Foy. So we crossed the little ferry up here and then drove down into Foy. There's another ferry that goes down here that's a bigger one, but this is the way we came. We get into Foy, and this is the main street in Foy. There are smaller ones, But there's nothing bigger except for when you get into the square right by the harbor. How that Mercedes still had the end mirrors is beyond me. Because you're looking at it, you knew you were going to hit something. Never did. So we stayed in this bed and breakfast, and I dropped Joanne off. And I said, I'll be right back. I got to go park.
Famous last words.
About 45 minutes later, now mind you, I have no cash, right? I find the central parking lot. And I'm looking at this thing, they got the machine over there, and then a little sign, it says, an app called Just Park, you can use that. So there I am downloading Just Park, and it works, and it said, yes, fine. And so I'm relieved and walking back, and I arrived back, and she's going, where have you been? But we got in there and it was just fine. Now I don't have pictures of it, but our room was nothing but flamingos and pink and whatever. Okay, Foy is famous for their flowers. They have Britain in Bloom contests, and cities compete for that, and they're famous for that. So here is the river, and this is a little boat that takes you out to your yacht. Which in some cases are 27-foot boats, not yachts, but anyway. And so it's really pretty, and it was about 70 degrees. So here's one of the local residents. Now, here is, again, the boat that takes you out to your boats. Then the Polaron ferry, the big ferry, is this one. And it takes you across to a little town on the other side called Polaron. Some of you here I know, Don has been both places. He took a cruise, has been to both. So you're home. And here's more of the cars. This is the second largest street in Foy. And we stopped at a Spanish tapas bar. Very good, very nice. Joanne asked for Chardonnay and they went. But they had good Spanish white wine, so that was good. And you see behind it's a garage. That's only one of like 2 garages I saw in all of Foy. How people handle it, I don't know. As we're sitting there, the garage door opens and a man pulls up in his fancy SL Mercedes. And inside is his wife's Mini Cooper. And he comes out, shuts the garage, we say hello. He comes over, he sat down with us and he talked for a while. And he tells me that that garage increased the price of his home by 50%. That those are so rare. And okay, so now this is again Polaron and the harbor. They have large tides. There, goes way up and goes way down. And it's very pretty in Foy. Now Foy goes back to 1480 or earlier, actually to the 700s. But they built up the church about the 1400s. They had lots of fights with the French. The French attacked. And they actually repelled the French right outside the church in downtown Foy. They were using longbows to try and fight them off. And they built a fort on that side, and they built a fort on the other side, which they call castle, a castle, but it's a fort. And there I am looking out. There's the castle. Now, right on the edge is a little cove. And here's a picture from inside the cove. And this is where the smugglers were. They would come in, and after, probably during the 1500s, the biggest occupation was being a privateer, and they would come and bring stuff into the beach there. Now it's just a place to go swimming. Okay, the widest spot in one road in all of Foy, and we're now trying to get out, and that's not the way to go out. So we found the right direction, and we had to stop because this man is walking with his cell phone, and he was walking like this, and it took him forever to come by us. We finally got by, and so we made our way out of Foy thinking we've got it made, and then we found a B road. So you got to negotiate who's going to stop where, who's got to back up, and we dealt with it. He backed up, everything was going to be fine, and we come to the next one, and we're just about to take off, except for, look at this. Someone has come behind him. Now what do? Now 3 people have to negotiate what we're doing. So the B roads are certainly interesting. So Foy is a place that was recommended to me by a British friend. I was going to go to Plymouth. My dad's family go back to the Pilgrims, so going to Plymouth sounded, but he talked us into Foy, and I'm glad he did, because it's a great place. Okay, we picked Exeter to stop in going back because the map told us it's a good place to stop. And so the only thing we did in Exeter was go to the cathedral. And this is a nice little cathedral. Outside, very nice. Gee, surprise, surprise, scaffolding. And I don't have a picture of it, but up in the buttresses, up right over here, there's a peregrine falcon. And man had a lens on his camera to take a picture of the peregrine falcon, and that thing was this big. How he managed to lug that thing around is it's kind of like Bob Caswell and his gigantic one. Okay, again, very pretty ceilings, organs. You're going to see a few ceilings by the time you're done. Sorry about that, but I like them. The pulpits in each cathedral are beautiful. By the way, you know why every city has a cathedral in England? You can't be a city without having a cathedral by law. So dating way back, if you wanted to be a city, you had to build a cathedral. I'm sure the church loved that, but that's why there's so many around. Now the famous part about the Exeter Cathedral is the astronomical clock. Okay? This thing was built in 1484, and it has the Earth in the center. It has the moon going around and the sun going around. So here is the phases of the moon based on the way the sun and the moon are showing compared to each other, but it's got a 30-day cycle. Which I thought that was a little odd, but I thought even back in 1480s they knew better than a 30-day lunar calendar. Okay, the minutes wasn't added until 1760. So before that, you just guessed. But in those days, I suppose it didn't really matter. You didn't have a train to catch anyway. Okay, so Exeter survived World War II until the 42. And then when the British started bombing and the Americans started bombing Berlin, they came back to bomb any city they could. The Germans did. And most of Exeter's downtown was destroyed. The cathedral was not, except for the St. James Chapel had a direct hit. And this, they rebuilt it around, and then they put this driftwood cross in the spot where the chapel was destroyed. And the outbuildings for the cathedral. Now, after Exeter, we went to Southampton, where we met these friends from, their town is Clayton by the Swan. It's a little tiny village. John and Kath Hopkins, he was a royal prison guard. And so their royal prisons are in the hinterlands just like ours are. So he lived way off in the middle of nowhere. His wife worked at the prison. So he likes to tell people he married someone he met in prison. I took him on a trip to Alcatraz, and he didn't care about what the inmates went through. He wanted to see where all the facilities were for the guards. He wanted to know how all the controls worked, and he managed to corner somebody, and the rest of us are trying to get out of there, and John was just in seventh heaven. And I imagine to him, Alcatraz was a pilgrimage. So they had promised to take us to 3 places: Stonehenge, up to Bath, and those are by my request. And he said, "You were in the Navy." I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you have to go to Portsmouth." Portsmouth is where the Royal Navy is headquartered. And so that was on the list. So we stayed just north of, by Romsey, just north of Southampton, and drove and drove and then drove. And it was indeed a pleasure to turn the keys over to Enterprise and get rid of the car. So off we went to Stonehenge. Stonehenge is one interesting place. This is a panorama I took to get an overall look at it. Nowadays you have to have a reservation. They only allow so many at a time, and they don't allow you to wander around inside. So that's good if you want to take pictures, because otherwise you can't get a picture without tourists roaming around inside. So this worked rather nicely. And so that's an overall picture. Let's see if this works. This is a flyover from Apple Maps. They have an outer ring and an inner horseshoe of tall ones, and then blue stones and other stones that are throughout. The larger stones, they call them sarsen stones, and sarsen refers to Muslims, except in those days a sarsen was anyone who was not Christian. So this obviously was not a Christian time. After all, it's 2500 BC. So they call those sarsen stones. And they come from 19 miles away. And the big ones in the center are about 35 tons. And the smaller ones, these, are called blue stones, and they're from Wales, 150 miles away. And they weigh up to about 7 tons. So 5,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago, they were hauling stones from that distance, and they really don't know how they did it. They're thinking that they used boats for the blue stones from Wales, but they're not sure. But can you imagine 35 tons and hauling it? They think they put logs in front of them and pull them across the logs for 19 miles. Amazing. There's a lot more to Stonehenge than simply the henge itself. There's avenues that they'd built. There are mounds, which they call barrows. either round ones or long ones that are for burials. There are post holes that they don't know what they were there for. There's actually a wood henge nearby that is a stone henge, but all from timbers. And that dates to about the same time. So they don't know why. Here's how some people think they mounted the stones put the stones in the ground. They rolled them along, having dug big holes, have gigantic weights on them, pull the weights to the end, and that falls down, and then they lever them up and fill in with dirt. 35 tons they're dealing with that. Then they had the problem of putting the lintels on the top. So again, a guess, because nobody knows, is they put wood around it, would lever up the lintel, put a timber underneath it, keep levering it, go up, build it up, build it up, build it up, and then they used, they think, levers to lift and drop the lintel on top. They've got the tenon, you see up here? There's a little bump, and underneath these they dug holes, chipped away holes, so they drop in and hold them. And they have tongue and grooves between some of the bigger ones. You see over here, there's all these together, so there'll be a tongue and groove to stabilize there. All this is done 2500 BC. Mind-boggling.
Bob, are you going to mention the function that the geometry of this stuff?
About the astronomy of it, you can predict, no, you can, looking in a certain direction at the winter solstice and the summer solstice, you can see the sunrise over or right next to certain stones. So they obviously had a good knowledge of astronomy when they did this 5,000 years ago. The other place that I've been to in Ireland is Newgrange, just north of Dublin. Been there? One has. They have this mound, the stones around it, mound, and there is a tunnel into it that on the winter solstice, the sun comes in at sunrise and lights up the inside of this, the end of it. And if you want to experience that, it's a 10-year lottery. You can put your name in the hat, and 10 years ahead, and they'll draw, and then you hope that you're still there when it's time to go. That's Newgrange. Okay, this is, I've never seen crowds quieter than walking around Stonehenge. Everyone's just in awe.
One of the things that's quite amazing about the place is that there is no particular evidence of modern civilization to be seen out to the horizon for 360 degrees. They've legislated.
Yes.
They just don't.
As a matter of fact, they're digging the road, they're digging the highways down so that you won't be able to see the cars go by.
There's a huge controversy over the upgrade of the freeway that goes by.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I spent a whole lot more time on Stonehenge. Those are the barrows we're talking about. Let's go to Bath. It's in Somerset. Bath was where Queen Anne recuperated from some illnesses. She was not a healthy queen. And when she went out there, it became very popular. As a matter of fact, the city was so enamored with bringing people in, they even had their own master of ceremonies that organized all the partying. They even had rules of conduct of how you could act. And let's say that the upper class and the royalties thoroughly enjoyed themselves in Bath. It was rather hedonistic, I understand. So this is Bath. And ever wondered what they do with the royal telephones, the telephone booths that they don't use anymore? They filled it with that. That's kind of nice. But my favorite is not that. It's a defibrillator. Okay, Bath has an abbey, and it is right next to the baths themselves. The baths were developed by the Romans. Hot springs have been visited for centuries, but the Romans and baths go together just like this. And so they built up the baths. It's the only hot spring in England, and it's producing 250,000 gallons of hot water a day. The lower section is pretty much Roman. All the upper parts now are all Victorian. They were all done in the late 1800s. The Romans had a temple along with the baths. And my favorite part of what they did was they call them curse tiles. Bronze tiles that you could scratch in curses for whoever's wronged you. And they would go into the temple of Minerva, and Minerva would then read the curses and supposedly take care of the people that have wronged you. So here's statues of Caesars and Roman generals. Vespasian was the general there at that time, and he later became an emperor of Rome. The baths don't look too enticing to me. They say, don't put your hands in it, don't get in it, but everyone was doing that. Not getting in it, but putting their hands in it. And it's hot. They say 55 degrees centigrade. What's that, about 130 degrees? 135 degrees? So plenty hot. The Romans liked to stay warm. I guess the climate in England was not to their liking. And this is the base of a floor in the temple area. And they had a fire that would send smoky air underneath this. The tile floor was on top of that, and so the floor was heated. So it had central heating. And here is water that's coming in from the outside. Who can tell me what the zigzag lines mean? I asked my friend in the UK and he went, I don't know. I think it's kind of, you must stay clear, but I don't know. And you would figure someone who grew up in England would know that, but he went, ah. So Bath itself became popular all at once, and they had architects that would design and lay out the area, and they built the facade of where people lived. Only the facade. When you bought this one, you had to get someone to come in and build the backside. So everything looked the same, but everything inside was totally different. Bit strange. And this is John and Kath and Joanne, and we stopped at a pub on the way back to Southampton for one reason, and that was England versus Belgium, which they lost. But it didn't matter because it was in the first round, and it didn't matter. But John was silent for a while. Okay, Portsmouth. Portsmouth is southeast of Southampton, and this is not my picture. You'd figure when I'm there, I'd take a picture of the big tower. Got home, not one picture of the big tower. So this is the Emirates Tower, Spinnaker Tower, and you're way up there looking down at Portsmouth. And we look down at the naval yard there. This is the HMS Warrior. It's from about 1860. The HMS Victory is right here. And this flat building is the Museum for the Mary Rose. Heard of the Mary Rose? It sank in 1545 against the French, right there outside Portsmouth. And they were looking for it, but we'll get to that. Here's the Victory. She was launched in I can't remember. Nelson was on the Victory at Trafalgar, the Battle of Trafalgar. And this is the most famous ship in the English Navy, and it is still a active ship. Sits there in dry dock, but it's still an active ship. The Constitution is also still in the U.S. Navy. So there's the Victory. There we are on board. And now, I bet you don't know where Trafalgar is. Who knows? It's on the coast of Spain, almost at Gibraltar. And so down here under Spain, and it's just a little cape that sticks out there, and the battle was out here. And Nelson, of course, died, and there's the spot on the deck. And then when you go down below, there's the spot he died. The surgeon took care of him. So it's a fascinating thing. It was 102 guns on it, huge, and it is going through a big refit. The enlisted were in regular hammocks, and the officers, except for the top ones, had more of a squared off with more of a mattress in it. So that was fascinating. Now the Mary Rose, built in 1509, sank in 1545. They think that's what she looked like. They're not sure. When it sank, she took with her almost the entire crew. And so there's 400 and some people died. And the reason they died was to prevent boarders, they put a net over the top so that it would make it harder for the French to come in and try and capture, send their Marines over. So it had a netting over the whole top. So when the ship went down, nobody could get out.
They didn't have knives?
What?
They didn't have knives that they could cut it?
It went down in 3 minutes. It went down because they think that they fired a broadside, they swung about, and either the wind caught the sails and brought it over, and through stupidity they did not close the gun ports on the other side. So the water just came right in. And they didn't know where it was until 1972. And they found a wrought iron cannon on the seabed, and that was not used after about 1500 and something. So they said, this must be the Mary Rose. And they found it, they found this in 65. They discovered the ship itself in 1972, and they raised it in 1984. And this is what they raised. The rest of it is gone. And they had spent between 84 and 2016 restoring, preserving it, and they built a museum around it. And here's the hull of the Mary Rose. This is probably the most fascinating Navy museum I've ever seen. They found over 200 bodies inside the Mary Rose. It was on the floor of the sea for 437 years, and they still had skulls, including the carpenter's dog. So that's the Mary Rose. There's 26,000 artifacts they found, and the museum is fabulous, absolutely fabulous. Okay, now we spent all this time just in the south of England. We left from Southampton, and Southampton is where my grandparents lived when my grandfather worked for Canadian Pacific Steamship. So he sent many a ship out from these wharves. and they still do. Bon voyage. Okay, Guernsey. Guernsey is down here, right by the coast of France. The English and the French fought over and exchanged Guernsey and Jersey for centuries. And finally the Pope, I think in 1480 something, said, that's it, they're neutral, you can't do anything. And 3 years later, the French invaded, and they were repelled, and then privateers were causing a lot of trouble, and I can't remember the name of the king. One of the kings, I think it's one of the Jameses, said that's it, and he came in and took it over. And it's been English ever since, except now it's kind of neutral. It's English for foreign policy, and it's independent for everything else inside. So there's Guernsey. This is St. Peter Port, and you notice that the walls, the tide is 22 plus feet there. They also love their flowers. It's a tourist town, as you can tell by that. This is Castle Cornet that was used to defend the port. And in the late 1800s, it became very popular for baths. The English really got into going into cold seawater. And these were all destroyed with a big storm. In about 2010, they've been restored. Now, the real story, interesting story of Guernsey is the German occupation in World War II. 1942, I think it was May. The residents realized that it was getting pretty dicey. They packed up 17,000 kids and some women and sent them to England, and a week later, the Germans landed at the airport and took over. So 20,000 people survived the war. On there, the Germans thought that the English would want it back, so they made it the centerpiece of Fortress Atlantic. And they built some incredible gun emplacements. They put in 70 miles of tunnels. They put 20,000 troops, and they just sat there for the rest of the war because the English weren't interested in rescuing the Channel Islands. They just let it sit. So the amount of time they spent was incredible for nothing. And one of the tunnels that we went into is entrance here, back tunnel, and then 3 or 4 tunnels, side tunnels that they put tanks for oil tanks, so for their U-boats and whatever. And so those sat there throughout the whole war. And this museum is really quite fascinating. The Germans didn't treat the slave labor very well. Most of them were from the Eastern Front, Ukrainians, Russians, etc. And most of them did not survive the war. Even the Germans practically starved to death at the end, because after D-Day, there was no supplying, so they had to live off their own. So there wasn't a single Guernsey cow left by the end of the war. One of the children said when they were evacuated to England, she didn't know cows came in anything but white and brown, because that's the way Guernsey cows are. Okay, and of course, who's seen the movie? Who's read the book? It's great, very interesting. This society was started when they were partying at somebody's house, which they weren't supposed to be, and they were coming back drunk and making too much noise, and they were cornered by Germans, and the Germans demanded, what are they doing? And one of them blurted out, well, we're just a literary society, and we were reading a book, and we got carried away. And so the German officer said, I'll be there the next meeting, which was, they said, a week later. So they had to form the society. And they did. The book is written by an American, and it's a very fascinating book. The book is better than the movie. The movie's pretty good. Okay, in Ireland, Cove. Cove is a small port that was called Queenstown before the Irish Republic was founded in 1922. And it was named that because Queen Victoria visited there and they named it Queenstown. Queenstown is the last place the Titanic stopped before. Cove, C-O-B-H, is it's a word that sounds like cove in a Gaelic way, but it's a meaningless word in Gaelic. They do have a train that runs from there to Cork, and so we were on that. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is because I'm going to show Belfast next. And Belfast is where the Titanic was built. I've skipped Cork and Dublin because 2 weeks ago, that's what you saw. Belfast, that's the Titanic Museum. Fortunately, Joanne's camera took this picture because my camera took one look at all this and couldn't focus. So I had it on autofocus and it's all blurred.
Was Gary the architect?
I don't know who the architect is. It looks like a Gary though, doesn't it? Harlan and Wolff were the builders of the Titanic. They were one of the major shipbuilders in the time, and still they're there. And at this museum is the Nomadic. The Nomadic was the tender they used to bring passengers from Cherbourg or anywhere that they didn't have a dock. And here is the SS Nordic, and it's a fascinating little place, sitting in a dry dock. And here's a picture and a painting of the Nordic next to, in the case of the painting, next to the Titanic. Okay, now, also in Belfast is the Parliament. The Parliament is, well, it looks a little strange. What's wrong?
Flag's fine.
No flag?
It's abandoned. They've got a gate across it. The Irish Republic, when it was founded, Northern Ireland stayed with the UK. After the Good Friday Agreement, they said, okay, we will jointly share the governance of Northern Ireland. And to make sure that happened, they wrote into their constitution that on important matters, all major people have to agree. So that means the Protestants, or the Unionists, and the Catholics, or the Nationalists, would have to agree on major things. They would have to have a majority of both. Well, that doesn't work too well. The thing that kicked it over the edge was they wanted to have Sinn Féin, the large nationalist party, wanted to put Gaelic as well as Gaelic. I'm from Scotland, Gaelic, on all the signs. And the Protestants said no. And it got so contentious that they had to dissolve it, and the number 2 on it, the person that resigned, the number 2 was from Sinn Féin. He refused to accept the prime ministership, and therefore everything ground to a halt. And nothing's happened since. That was 2017. There is no government of Northern Ireland. It's been kicked to London. So London does it. And here's one of the famed peace walls. So when they first started building the wall to keep the Catholics and Protestants together during the Troubles, they built a wall about that high. Then they found out that it wasn't high enough. They were crawling over it. So they built it higher. Then they found out they were throwing Molotov cocktails over that, so they built it even higher. And The walls are still there. There are graffiti all over it, and the government actually encourages the graffiti. Nobody wants the walls to come down because they're afraid if the walls come down, the troubles may start again. And here's one of the major walls, and this particular wall has one gate that's been opened once, and that was by the Dalai Lama. He's the only one to ever go through that wall. There are other walls that have gates people go through, but this particular one. All throughout, they have different signs and paintings, and this is obviously on the Catholic side, and this is obviously on the Unionist side. And they really are passionate about that. They still have the marches every July. So all the Protestant groups will march up and down the streets, and all the Catholic groups will march up and down the streets. And we were there at the beginning of July, and it was probably at about another week or two before the marches started. Here's Bobby Sands. He is a martyr for the Republic side. He was on a hunger strike and died. It's still pretty dicey. To make matters worse, the Good Friday Agreement said there's no border, no closed border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Brexit, that's a problem. Because that means if there's no border between there's no border between the UK and Europe. And that's the big fight over Brexit, is what do we do about Northern Ireland? And the folks that we talk to in Northern Ireland are scared to death because they remember the troubles quite well. And they're afraid it's all going to start again. Okay, Glasgow. My mother's family is from the Glasgow area. They're Drummonds. Little Cole Drummond Newcomb, my grandson, been named Drummond. And so we're going to be in Glasgow, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and up here in Inverness. There's Loch Ness. So let's jump on forward. You can't get to Glasgow by sea. You have to stop at Greenock. And we took a bus in, and we're going to be looking only at two things. Well, the downtown, the cathedral, Glasgow Cathedral, and Kelvingrove, the museum. War Memorial, this is again for World War I. City Hall. There's Sir Walter Scott statue in George III, or George Square, or George's Square it used to be called. I don't know why they have it, because the Scots don't like George any more than we do, but they have George's Square. And here's Sir Robert Peel, a prime minister who was involved in Ireland and Scotland. He was involved in an assassination attempt. They didn't kill him, they killed a Drummond, one of my family. He was his personal secretary. But of the Peel, my favorite, though, is this picture of the statue of Peel, because of that. Okay, you folks know I like Apple stuff, and here's the Apple store. There was an Apple store everywhere. But the reason I have it in here, this is the best. Cheaper Apple repairs with an arrow going that way to keep you away from the Apple store. I love it. Okay, Glasgow Cathedral. Glaswegians are known to be, and the Scots are known to be, a little on the dour side. They take their religion very seriously, and it's the darkest cathedral I've ever seen in my entire life. It is almost oppressive inside. You don't see bright ceilings here, do you? And they use a very dark stone. Pretty walls, stained glass windows, but everything is dark. And I was actually kind of glad to get out of there. It was almost spooky dark. Okay, Kelvingrove. We've come up to the taxi took us there, we get out, there's a man sitting there with an Angels hat. So I went up, hi, another Angels fan. And he looked at me. And I said, the Angels? And he looked at me. I said, that hat for the California or the Los Angeles Angels? He goes, oh. He said, someone gave him a hat. He had no idea where it was from. But he at least took our picture for us. Okay, Kelvin Grove is a fabulous museum. And every day at 1 o'clock they have a concert. They have a Salvador Dali painting. But it's filled with controversy because it costs a lot of money. Glaswegians are cheap. I can say that, I'm a Scot. And so there was a controversy. They paid so much money for the Dali, but they have. There's a museum that has nothing but tapestries, but it was closed, but they had some of the tapestries in the Kelvin Grove. Museums in the UK are all free, which is wonderful. Going into a cathedral, though, isn't necessarily free. And there we're going back down the Clyde, heading back to the ship. And heading up the west coast of Scotland. Okay, Inverness. Cotter Castle was built in around the 1600s, and it was built by the clan Cotter. And in the 1600s, the Campbells took it. And the Campbells have it ever since. And it's still lived in. It's lived in the off season, and it's for the tourists in the summer. And it's a beautiful place.
So it's privately owned.
Privately held. Depending on where in Scotland you're from, you either like the Campbells or you hate the Campbells. Can you imagine living in that place?
Where is that?
It is near Inverness, just to the northeast of Loch Ness.
Other side of Culloden.
It's fairly near Culloden, yeah.
You go past Culloden now.
Yes, which another Drummond died at.
And Inverness is the start of the McBean clan.
Is it?
Yeah, 1652.
So they're also famous for the gardens at Cotter Castle, and they are beautiful. And then there's always a Scot trying to get you to give him a pound or two to play the bagpipes. Okay, Urquhart Castle. Urquhart Castle was built 1200s, started in the 1200s, built up around the 1500s, and it got exchanged between Scottish clans for centuries. And then the English started coming in and taking it over, and then a Scot group would take it back, and they have a trebuchet out front to show you how they would storm them. And there's Loch Ness. Somewhere out there is Nessie. But it's 700 feet deep. So good luck finding Nessie. The castle is pretty much a ruin because when the James II was overthrown, people took over the castle. The Jacobites were on James's side, and so they tried to storm the castle. It failed, but when the soldiers were in it, when they left, they didn't want the Jacobites to come back and have it, so they blew it up. So this was blown up in the 1600s, and it's been a ruin ever since. A famous ruin, but a ruin ever since. Okay, so Nessie, where are you? We looked, everyone looks. Okay, now we headed over to Edinburgh. In Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland, this is their Walter Scott Memorial, a little bit bigger than Glasgow's. This was very impressive, and I found out it's nothing but a building of banks, but it's impressive looking. Joanne's favorite piper. Edinburgh Castle. Edinburgh Castle has been around for centuries, and it's where Mary Queen of Scots gave birth to James. And there's the 1 o'clock gun. I came running up to it, got my camera this far when they fired, so I missed it. But every day at 1 o'clock they fire it. This is the viewing of Edinburgh from the castle. A very controversial statue, that's Haig. Haig was the general who was in charge of the Battle of the Somme. And he's now known as a butcher, but he was quite famous in the early. When they made the statue, he was considered good. Now he's not. The Great Hall that has all their armor. Now the Royal Palace, and there's where the crown jewels are for Scotland. The line was out of sight, so we didn't go in. This is in front of the castle. This is where the military tattoo is every August. So they have pipers and all that. It's a great show. I was there 23 years before this, also in the middle of a drought, and it rained on us once while we were sitting here, and it poured. Here is High Street or the Royal Mile. Deacon Brodie. Deacon Brodie is a tavern in his name, and the reason is Robert Louis Stevenson based Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde based on Deacon Brodie. Deacon Brodie was actually not a crazy type, but he was a well-to-do cabinet maker. He was the deacon of his guild, and at night he stole. And he would copy everyone's keys and go in and rob them blind. And when he finally got caught, they hanged him right there on High Street in front of 40,000 people. And apparently Robert Louis Stevenson's father had furniture made by Deacon Brodie. Okay, here's St. Giles Cathedral. Looks quite dour on the outside. Inside, not so. Inside, it's beautiful. What a difference in the light inside St. Giles than Glasgow. This everyone thinks is the cathedral, it's just a church. Looking down High Street, there's the Queen's Ferry, the Forth Bridge. It's the Firth of Forth, so that's the Forth Bridge, F-O-R-T-H, not the F-O-U-R. Not to be confused with the second one here that's the Forth Bridge, F-O-U-R. And then there's another one behind it that's the Queen's Ferry Bridge, Queen's Crossing Bridge. Okay, now just very quickly take you through a few slides of Paris. We got our standard Eiffel Tower. We have the scariest place to go, which is the Champs-Élysées around the Arc de Triomphe, because the taxi drivers around there are insane. When we went through there, we were this far away from other cars. And he didn't care, he just went through. Everyone had to stop for him. That was scary. And then, of course, Cathedral Notre Dame. And here's the scaffolding, goes up, goes over. The big tower that for the spire that fell, that they got the big pictures of it crashing down, that's that. And so, quite sad. And I'm sure Madeline is in there somewhere. That was so cute. And that's it.
Thank you.